Sego. In the following video, I am going to show 6 types of knife that were used before ironworking was introduced. Blades like these are not exclusive to the pre-Columbian Americas, they were used by all Neolithic peoples throughout the world. In this video, I'd like to show off some of the strengths and weaknesses of each sort of blade. To begin with, let's look at one of the simplest and most common forms of cutting implement, the stone flake. These are common because they require no skill whatsoever to manufacture. You simply take a lump of flint and smash it into pieces against another rock. These are also a byproduct of crafting more sophisticated blades. As you can see, flint naturally breaks into very thin, sharp pieces. Now let's look at a proper stone knife. I'm not skilled enough to make a good replica of one of these, so this is an artifact arrowhead that I've re-hilted. I believe it's made from chalcedony. This is what most people will think of when they hear about a prehistoric knife. Next, let's take a look at a bone knife. This example is made from a piece of antler. Ones made from leg bones were also common. These are crafted by grinding the antler against a stone. This is very time-consuming, but doesn't require too much skill. Bone isn't as hard as stone, and as such can't be made as sharp. Only about as sharp as your incisors. It has 2 big advantages. The first is that it's more widely available than good knappable stone. The second is that it's quite a bit more durable, allowing for longer blades and finer points. The next sort of knife is made of slate. Unlike flints and such, slate can't be knapped very well. Knives like these are ground into shape. Slate is quite a bit softer than flint. They can't be made as sharp and they're easy to blunt. The advantages to slate are that it's easy to manufacture and easy to resharpen. It's also more commonly found than flints and such. This shape of blade gives it a lot of strength, and one of these could last you for years. The next sort of knife is made of copper. Now, by definition, Neolithic peoples didn't have copper smelting technology. However, copper is one of the few metals that naturally occurs in solid form in some quantity. Native copper is quite rare, but Stone Age peoples made use of it wherever they could. In the modern era, most of the native copper has been mined and used up. So I cheated and used a modern alloy, which isn't the same but is the best I can do at this point. The final type of knife I'd like to show off is made from wood. But wait, I hear you say, surely wood is too soft to cut anything. And you'd be right, but this knife doesn't have to cut anything. Wooden knives were only made for combat. While the edge can't be made very sharp, the point can be made very pointy. This knife is made from ironwood and the tip has been fire hardened. The reason you might want to make a fighting knife out of wood or bone rather than flint is the fragility of flint. A flint blade can only be made about 4 inches long or so before it becomes too fragile to use. A longer knife is a big advantage in a fight. Flint blades also have a tendency to break if they strike something hard like armor. So that's it for the overview. Now let's see how they perform in various tasks. A good utility knife needs to be able to cut cords, leather, and softwood. A good cooking knife needs to be able to cut meat and fruit. A good fighting knife needs to penetrate clothing and skin. To start out, I'm going to try cutting a piece of garden twine. I'm having a little bit of difficulty actually starting the cuts. This is due to the natural serrations in the stone edge. However, once the cut starts, it goes through without any effort. Now I'm using the antler knife. This requires quite a bit more pressure than the stone one, but not too bad. Now the copper one. It goes through effortlessly. Copper, despite being softer than steel, can be made nearly as sharp, though the edge will blunt fairly quickly. Now I'm trying the slate knife. This is awkward for me because I don't know exactly how you're supposed to hold it. It takes a couple of slices, but it does go through without too much difficulty. Here I try holding it differently, it seems to work a bit better. Now the wooden knife. Despite my best efforts, all I managed to accomplish was blunt the edge. Now let's try the flakes. Flakes were a waste product of creating more sophisticated tools. Because of this, they were disposable. Because of this, if one of your flakes blunted, you would just get a new one. Because of this, stone flakes are much sharper than other sorts of stone knife. Now I'm going to try cutting through some sinew thread. As before, the stone knife first. It goes through very easily. Now the antler knife. The antler knife is only able to cut through a few fibers of the cord at a time. Far from an ideal tool, but it would work if you had nothing better. Now the copper knife. Something that's important is to know how to use your tools correctly and safely. Unaccustomed to using double-edged knives, during the previous test I nicked my finger with the back edge of this blade. But I digress. The knife goes through the sinew without effort. Now the slate knife. The slate knife doesn't appear to be cutting any fibers, it just appears to be stretching the cord. It could be that I ground the edge too smooth, and that there's no little rough spots to catch and tear the fibers of the cord. It could be slate knives are just incapable of cutting sinew. Or it could just be that I don't know how to use slate knives. Now the flake. The major shortcoming of the flake is how small and jagged they are. This makes them awkward to use. I end up using the stump like a cutting board. This is not ideal as the edges of the flakes are paper thin and get blunted very quickly against hard surfaces like wood. They're a bit of a hassle to use, but they work. Now I'm going to try whittling a small pine branch. What I'm trying to do here is cut into the wood. The knife really doesn't want to do this though. It slips under the bark well enough, but it doesn't go into the wood very deeply. Could be due to the serration of the blade, but I honestly don't know for sure. Now I'm trying to saw through the branch, make those serrations work in my advantage. This works to make shallow cuts into the stick. However, the depth of these cuts is limited by the geometry of the blade. On a crosscut saw, the teeth are set wider than the width of the blade. This means that your cut is always wide enough to accommodate your saw. On a knife, the edge is the thinnest spot. This means that the cut is always going to be too narrow to accommodate the blade. What I could do if I wanted to saw through the twig is make a shallow cut and then another one immediately adjacent to it, progressively widening the cut. Not the most time-efficient method, but I could make it work. What I'm doing here is just scraping away the rest of the bark. The knife works reasonably well, but the serrated edge gets gummed up with bits of bark. Now I'm trying the antler knife. Similar sort of problem. It goes through the bark easy enough, but it doesn't want to go into the wood. In this case, I think the issue is that the blade just isn't sharp enough. But look at the speed with which it can remove bark. It is capable of removing small flakes of wood, but it doesn't do it very quickly. Sawing accomplishes nothing. Awful noise. Now the copper knife. It goes through the wood like butter. I am able to whittle the stick to a point in a matter of seconds. As I keep saying, copper can get nearly as sharp as steel, it's just not as durable. Now the slate knife. It bites into the wood quite happily. The only issue being that it's a little bit awkward to hold. I find it odd that this does better than the knapped stone knife, because the slate knife just isn't as sharp as the other one. Maybe it's due to the smoothness of the edge. It can slip between the wood fibers more easily. I don't know. Sawing was a really bad idea. It chewed up the edge and I needed to resharpen it. But resharpening was easy enough, a few scrapes of the whetstone. Now the flakes. These are really awkward to use for this. It's hard to get a good angle, and they hurt your hands if you push too hard. I would not want to use flakes for woodworking. Now the wooden knife. It removes the bark well enough, but it can't cut into the wood to any degree. Now let's try cutting through a scrap of leather. Stone knife is up first. It takes a couple of slices, but it goes through without too much difficulty. Let's see how the antler knife does. It is capable of going through the leather, it just takes a while. The knife can only cut through a few layers of skin at a time. Not very effective. You wouldn't use a bone knife for this if you had any alternative. Took you long enough. Now the copper knife. As you can see, it cuts almost all the way through the leather with one slice. Now the slate knife. The first slice goes about halfway through the leather. The second slice accomplishes almost nothing. And the third slice goes all the way through. It's not terribly efficient, but it's quite comfortable in the hand when you're doing cuts like this. Now let's try the flake. The main limiting factor of the flake here is the size. If you want to keep a firm grip, you can only cut a little bit of the leather at a time. Now let's try poking holes in the leather. If you're sewing, ideally you'd use an awl for this, but you might not always have access to an awl. The stone knife is having quite a bit of trouble getting through the leather. The point isn't very fine, and I don't want to force it and risk breaking it, seeing as this is an artifact. Now let's try the bone knife. The point is quite fine and the antler is very strong, so I feel confident putting my strength behind this. It goes through with a bit of effort. A bone knife would be a viable alternative to an awl. Now let's try the copper one. It should be noted that in this particular test, my reproduction may not be representative of a historical artifact. Modern alloys are stronger than pure copper, and native copper generally has voids and inclusions. So I don't know whether a historical copper knife would be strong enough to be pushed through the leather without bending. In any case, this one goes through the leather without too much difficulty, though it does tend to make messy holes. Now the flake. The flake is of no use for poking holes. You have to make tiny little cuts instead. A little awkward, but you can make it work. Now the slate knife. The slate knife doesn't have a point. This is one of its shortcomings. If you give it a point, it won't be strong enough for cutting. And if you make it strong enough for cutting, it can't have a point. So just like the flake, if you want to make a hole, you have to make a tiny little cut instead. The length of the blade makes tiny little cuts difficult. Now the wooden knife. So far it's proved pretty useless, but let's see how it does. It goes through very easily, with almost no effort. Bit more effort that time, but still pretty easy. One more time just to see if the first two were a fluke. Nope. Let's see how these knives do for preparing food. As always, the stone knife goes first. It goes through the meat very easily. It has a bit of trouble with the fat and gristle, but not too bad. Part of the issue with the fat is that it gums up the serrations, but all in all, pretty good. Let's try the antler knife. It goes through the meat pretty well. This shouldn't be surprising. If bone wasn't sharp enough to handle meat, our teeth would be made out of something else. It has some trouble with the gristle. Again, this makes sense. Most people, when eating a steak, cut off the gristle and give it to the dog. Now the copper knife. As anticipated, it goes through everything easily. Now the slate knife. The slate knife performs exceptionally well here, going through meat and gristle with ease. The shape of the knife makes it very comfortable to use for this task. If you gotta slice meat and you can't use a metal tool, this is the tool to use. Now the wooden knife. It's not very effective, but if it's all you had, you could use it to butcher a deer. Now let's try a flake. The flake is not very effective, but the limiting factor is the size and awkwardness rather than the sharpness. A few chunks of steak by themselves aren't a very exciting lunch, so let's throw an apple into the mix. Stone knife first. Takes a bit of effort to slice, but not too bad. It works. Now the antler knife. It doesn't so much cut the apple as it does split it apart. Interesting. Copper knife, again, it goes through easily. Slate knife now. Just like the bone one, it doesn't cut into the apple, it just splits off a chunk. Probably due to how wedge-like the blade is. Same thing with the wooden knife, but not quite as effectively. The flakes were of no use for cutting the apple, they weren't long enough to get a slice. I was gifted a deerskin to practice tanning on, so let's take this opportunity to do some tests. It's a lot stretchier than the finished leather. The stone knife can't make a dent in it, and once again I don't want to force it and risk breaking the blade. I can hear you thinking, how could an arrowhead possibly be bad at getting through skin? Surely that's what it's designed for. And well, an arrow I guess strikes with a lot more energy than my hand does. The finer point of the antler knife goes through the skin very easily. The wooden knife goes through very easily as well. This proves my point that while a wooden knife may be a lousy tool, it's a formidable weapon. The slate knife doesn't have a point to punch through it, but it does slice through it fairly quickly. And there you have it. To summarize, flakes are very sharp, but awkward to use. The knapped knife is good for cutting cords and leather, but bad at making holes. The wood and bone knives are bad at cutting, but good at poking holes. The slate knife is good at cutting meat and softwood, and the copper knife is good at everything. And that's all I have to say about that. Niaha for watching. I hope you enjoyed or at least learned something. Bye-bye.